I hid in the carriage of the Empire's most terrifying executioner to escape a monster. I fully expected to die. Instead, he pulled me onto his lap and whispered, "I will protect you." And then, he started a war against the Emperor just to keep me. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The freezing rain slashed against my pale face as I tore through the dark cobblestone streets. My breathless gasps were completely swallowed by the violent roar of the midnight storm. The heavy white silk of my wedding dress dragged through the thick mud like a sodden shroud. I was running from a fate that was infinitely worse than death itself. Baron Silas, the ruthless man my bankrupt uncle had sold me to, was hunting me with his vicious hounds. He was known throughout the entire kingdom for his immense wealth, his sadistic cruelty, and his many deceased wives. I was young and considered beautiful, which only made me his most prized new target. I would rather drown in the freezing river than ever wear his cursed golden wedding ring. The frantic barking of the hunting dogs grew louder, echoing terrifyingly off the narrow brick walls of the alleyway. They were getting closer with every agonizing second. My bare feet bled heavily against the sharp stones, but the pure terror pumping through my veins pushed me forward. I could not let his guards drag me back to that monstrous man. Suddenly, I stumbled blindly out of the narrow alley and into the sprawling cathedral square. Parked silently in the deep shadows of the towering Gothic arches stood a massive midnight black carriage. It was a monstrously huge vehicle, pulled by four terrifyingly restless black warhorses. Even in the pouring darkness, I could clearly see the silver crest embossed on its heavy wooden door. It was a roaring lion clutching a broken, bleeding crown. My blood ran entirely cold inside my veins. Every single citizen in the sprawling empire intimately knew that dreaded, blood-soaked crest. It belonged exclusively to Alaric, the undisputed Duke of Ravenscroft. He was the Emperor's personal executioner, a man forged in brutal warfare and rumored to possess a heart of pure ice. People whispered that he was a living demon who killed without a second thought. But as the torches of Baron Silas's men flared brightly at the end of the street, I had no other choice. A known demon was 1,000 times better than the monster actively hunting me. With trembling, desperate hands, I grabbed the cold iron handle of the carriage door. I pulled it open, threw my freezing body inside, and slammed the heavy door shut just as the hounds rounded the corner. The interior was pitch black, smelling deeply of rich leather, dark cedar, and cold steel. I collapsed onto the plush velvet floorboards, pressing both hands over my mouth to muffle my ragged breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying desperately to the heavens that the Duke was not currently inside. Then, the unmistakable sound of a heavy pistol cocking shattered the absolute silence. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger." The voice was low, violently smooth, and colder than the raging storm outside. My heart violently slammed against my ribs. I slowly opened my eyes, my vision quickly adjusting to the dim moonlight slipping through the velvet curtains. He was sitting deep in the corner, a towering silhouette of broad shoulders and lethal stillness. The faint light caught the silver edge of the gun pointed directly at my chest. I could not see his eyes in the shadows, but I could feel the intense, predatory weight of his gaze. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking uncontrollably. "They are going to force me to marry a monster." I slowly pushed myself up onto my freezing knees, my ruined wedding dress pulling miserably around me. If they find me tonight, my life is completely over. I didn't ask for mercy, because men like the Duke of Ravenscroft did not understand mercy. Outside, heavy boots stomped violently against the wet cobblestones right next to the carriage. "Search the alley and check the square," a gruff voice commanded, the sound bleeding through the thick wooden walls. "The Baron wants his beautiful little bride returned to him immediately." I flinched sharply, instinctively curling my body into a tight, trembling ball of sheer panic. Tears of absolute despair finally spilled over my freezing cheeks. I waited for the cruel Duke to kick me out, to throw me to the ravenous wolves waiting outside. Instead, I heard the soft, purposeful rustle of heavy wool and expensive leather. A large, incredibly warm hand suddenly clamped firmly over my trembling mouth. The metallic scent of the gun vanished, instantly replaced by the intoxicating, masculine warmth of his body. Before I could even gasp, strong arms forcefully hauled me up from the hard floorboards. He pulled me entirely onto his lap, pressing my wet, shivering body tightly against his massive chest. His heavy, fur-lined winter cloak enveloped me completely, hiding my bright white dress in total, comforting darkness. "My Lord Duke," a guard shouted arrogantly from outside, violently banging a fist against the carriage door. "We are searching for a runaway bride. Have you seen a woman pass by this way?" I froze entirely, my lungs burning painfully as I held my breath in sheer, unadulterated terror. The Duke's large hand remained securely over my mouth, his thumb gently tracing my jawline in the dark. His broad chest rumbled deeply against my back as he finally spoke to the guard. "Are you intentionally interrupting my peace, soldier?" His voice was lethally calm, dripping with a terrifying, undeniable aristocratic menace. There was a sudden, horrified gasp of realization from outside the carriage. "And no, Your Grace. Please forgive me. We did not know it was your carriage. Step away from my property before I have your useless hands severed from your wrists. At once, Your Grace. Retreat. Everyone retreat right now." The chaotic sound of panicked boots and whining hounds rapidly faded away into the stormy night. I remained completely frozen against him, too terrified of this dangerous man to move a single muscle. The carriage plunged back into an absolute, heavy silence that felt thicker than the darkness. Slowly, the powerful Duke lowered his calloused hand from my mouth. I fully expected him to angrily push me away, to demand a harsh explanation, or to toss me out into the rain. Instead, his strong muscular arm tightened securely and possessively around my waist. He leaned his head down, his breath brushing hotly against the freezing shell of my ear. "You are safe now, my little runaway," he whispered, his voice suddenly shedding all of its icy cruelty. The carriage began to move with a sudden, powerful lurch of the great black warhorses. I remained pinned against Alaric's massive chest, the steady beat of his heart echoing against my own. His expensive wool cloak felt like a fortress, shielding me from the cruel world outside. I could still hear the faint, receding sound of Baron Silas's men shouting in the distance. But inside this moving sanctuary, the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the most dangerous man in the Empire. I felt incredibly small and fragile within his heavy, muscular embrace. Every time the carriage jolted over the wet stones, his arm tightened possessively around my waist. He didn't speak for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dark velvet curtains. The silence was heavy, filled with an intensity that made my skin tingle with a strange, new heat. Finally, I summoned the courage to look up at him through my tangled, wet hair. The moonlight caught the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw and the cold glint in his grey eyes. He looked like a statue carved from ancient, weathered stone, beautiful but utterly lethal. "Why were you running, Amelia?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that stirred my soul. I flinched at the sound of my own name falling from his lips. I hadn't told him my name, yet he clearly already knew exactly who I was. "My uncle, he sold my hand in marriage to pay off his gambling debts," I whispered, my voice trembling. "He chose Baron Silas because the man offered the highest price for my youth." I felt a sudden, violent surge of tension ripple through Alaric's powerful frame. His hand, still resting on my hip, flexed with a sudden, dangerous strength. "Silas is a bottom-feeding scavenger who enjoys breaking things that are beautiful," he spat with pure venom. "He has no right to touch a single hair on your head." I was stunned by the sheer, unadulterated fury in his tone. It wasn't just the anger of a noble being interrupted, it was the protective rage of a predator claiming his territory. I didn't know where else to go, I admitted, a fresh tear sliding down my cheek. I saw your crest and I thought I would rather die by your hand than live in his house. Alaric looked down at me then, his eyes darkening into a stormy, unreadable shade of charcoal. He reached up with one large, calloused hand and gently tucked a wet strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the terrifying reputation he carried. "You will not die by my hand, little one," he murmured, his thumb grazing my cheekbone. "And you will certainly never step foot inside that monster's house again." The carriage slowed as we entered the massive, iron gates of the Ravenscroft estate. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the heavy wheels as we wound up a long, dark driveway lined with ancient oaks. At the end stood a magnificent, sprawling stone manor that looked more like a fortress than a home. Torches flickered in the wind, casting long, dancing shadows across the grey stone walls. The carriage came to a complete halt, and a footman in dark livery immediately opened the door. I tried to pull away from Alaric, feeling a sudden rush of self-consciousness about my ruined appearance. But he didn't let me go. Instead, he stepped out of the carriage first, then reached back in and effortlessly scooped me up into his arms. I gasped, instinctively wrapping my arms around his thick neck for support. He carried me as if I weighed absolutely nothing, his stride long and filled with arrogant purpose. The servants standing at the entrance bowed their heads in deep, terrified silence as we passed. I could feel their shocked gazes on my muddy, torn wedding dress and my bare, blooded feet. No one had ever seen the Duke of Ravenscroft carry a woman into his home before. The grand entrance hall was filled with the scent of beeswax, old books, and expensive tobacco. He didn't stop until we reached a pair of massive, carved oak doors on the second floor. With a single kick, he opened the doors to a suite of rooms that were more luxurious than anything I had ever imagined. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the massive silk-draped bed. He placed me down gently on the soft, plush rug in front of the fire. I stood there shivering, looking like a drowned bird in the middle of a golden cage. Alaric stood before me, his towering height blocking out the rest of the world. He unfastened his heavy, wet cloak and let it fall to the floor without a second thought. Beneath it, he wore a black silk shirt that strained against the hard muscles of his chest and shoulders. "You belong to Ravenscroft now," he stated, his voice absolute and final. "In this house, no one can reach you, and no one can hurt you." He stepped closer, the heat from his body and the fire surrounding me entirely. "But remember this, Amelia," he added, his gaze burning into mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "I do not give away what belongs to me." I looked into his eyes and realized that I hadn't just escaped a forced marriage. I had stepped into the lair of a much more powerful, much more possessive king. And for the first time in my life, the thought didn't make me want to run. I woke up surrounded by the softest silk sheets and the faint, lingering scent of rich sandalwood. Warm morning sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely banishing the terrifying shadows of the previous stormy night. A cheerful, crackling fire was already burning brightly in the ornate marble fireplace across the vast, luxurious room. I sat up slowly in the massive bed, instantly realizing that my ruined, muddy wedding dress had been completely removed. In its place, I was wearing a delicate, exquisitely embroidered nightgown made of the finest white lace and soft cotton. A sudden, fierce blush crept up my neck as I wondered exactly who had changed my clothes while I slept so deeply. Before my panicked thoughts could spiral any further, the heavy oak doors opened with a soft, respectful click. 3 maids dressed in pristine black and white uniforms entered the room carrying heavy silver trays of food. They bowed deeply and respectfully, their eyes carefully lowered in a display of absolute subservience to their master's guest. "Good morning, my lady," the oldest maid said, her voice gentle, welcoming, and incredibly polite. His Grace ordered us to prepare a warm bath and a hearty breakfast for you the exact moment you awoke. They placed the heavy silver trays on a small table near the roaring fire, revealing fresh pastries, roasted meats, and steaming tea. I was completely overwhelmed by the sheer opulence and the meticulous, thoughtful care ordered by the terrifying Duke. Did His Grace stay in this room last night? I asked hesitantly, my voice still slightly raspy from the freezing storm. The oldest maid smiled kindly, shaking her head as she poured a cup of fragrant black tea. No, my lady, the Duke stood guard in the hallway outside your door for the entire night to ensure your absolute safety. My heart skipped a sudden, violent beat in my chest at her unexpected, breathtaking words. The most dangerous, feared man in the entire empire had treated me like a fragile, incredibly precious treasure. He had stood in the cold stone hallway all night long just to make sure a runaway bride could sleep peacefully. After a long, soothing bath in a sunken marble tub filled with expensive rose oils, the maids carefully dressed me. They brought me a stunning gown of deep emerald velvet, custom-tailored, and clearly incredibly expensive. It fit my body perfectly, making me look significantly less like a desperate runaway and much more like regal royalty. Just as I was finishing my delicious breakfast, a loud, angry commotion echoed heavily from the grand courtyard below my window. I rushed to the heavy glass panes, my breath instantly catching in my tight throat as pure terror resurfaced. A dozen armed men bearing the sickening green and gold colors of Baron Silas were shouting aggressively at the estate gates. The Baron's chief enforcer, a hulking brute named Thorn, was demanding immediate entry into the Duke's private territory. We know the runaway bride is hiding inside this manor. Thorn roared, waving a piece of legal parchment aggressively in the air. Baron Silas demands the immediate return of his legal property, by official order of the local city magistrate. Absolute terror flooded my veins once again, instantly freezing the warm breakfast sitting in my stomach. I gripped the heavy velvet curtains tightly, my knuckles turning stark white as I stared down at the violent mob. Suddenly, the massive front doors of Ravenscroft swung open with a deafening, terrifying thud that echoed across the grounds. Duke Alaric stepped out onto the white stone steps, looking exactly like a dark, wrathful god of war descending upon mortals. He was dressed in impeccable black riding leathers, a heavy silver broadsword resting casually but lethally at his hip. The sheer, overwhelming aura of his dark presence silenced the entire shouting mob in less than a single second. He did not yell, he did not rush, nor did he even bother to draw his magnificent weapon. He simply descended the stone stairs with slow, predatory grace, his cold grey eyes locked solely on Thorn. "You are trespassing on my sovereign land with weapons drawn," Alaric stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating purr that carried clearly on the wind. "That is an act of open, undeniable war against the ancient house of Ravenscroft." Thorn swallowed hard, his arrogant bravado instantly crumbling into dust under the Duke's icy, murderous stare. "Your Grace, we only seek the runaway girl," the enforcer stammered weakly, taking a fearful, clumsy step backward. "She legally belongs to the Baron." Alaric stopped just inches away from the heavily armed man, towering over him with terrifying, absolute dominance. "Nothing in this entire world belongs to Silas unless I personally permit it," the Duke whispered, yet his voice felt like thunder. "And the woman you are looking for is currently under my absolute, unconditional protection." He slowly pulled off his black leather glove, a simple gesture that made every single soldier flinch in sheer terror. "Tell your pathetic, cowardly master that if he ever sends his dogs to my gates again, I will not send them back alive. And if he ever dares to speak Amelia's name again, I will personally ride to his estate and cut out his wretched tongue." The absolute certainty of horrific violence in Alaric's calm voice was more than enough to break the men completely. Thorn nodded frantically, his face pale with sheer terror, before turning and scrambling desperately onto his horse. The entire squad of Silas's men fled down the gravel driveway like frightened children fleeing a nightmare. I let out a shaky, overwhelming breath of pure relief, pressing my hot forehead against the cool glass of the window. When I opened my eyes again, I gasped softly, because Alaric was looking directly up at my bedroom window. Even from this great distance, his intense, burning gaze locked instantly onto mine, sending a fiery shiver straight down my spine. He offered me a slow, incredibly possessive smirk that promised me absolute heaven, while promising pure hell to anyone who dared to touch me. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was technically trapped in a beautiful cage with a man who could destroy entire kingdoms with a single command. But as I touched the soft, luxurious velvet of my new emerald dress, I realized a shocking truth. I did not want to escape from the Duke of Ravenscroft. The most terrifying, dangerous man in the Empire was the only person who made me feel completely, wonderfully safe. His brutal, magnificent display of power in the courtyard was not a warning to me, but an impenetrable shield forged entirely for my protection. I knew in that exact moment that my tragic, fearful life would never, ever be the same again. The timid, frightened girl who ran sobbing through the rain was dead, replaced entirely by the chosen obsession of the Duke. And deep down, I was thrillingly ready to see exactly what being his cherished possession truly meant. Later that evening, a quiet, highly respectful knock summoned me from the absolute safety of my lavish bedroom. A senior servant politely informed me that His Grace formally requested my presence in his private, heavily guarded library. I walked slowly down the dimly lit stone corridors, my heavy emerald velvet gown brushing softly against the priceless antique rugs. The massive oak doors of the library stood partially open, revealing a breathtaking sanctuary of endless leather-bound books and ancient maps. The intoxicating scent of aged parchment, rich mahogany, and expensive tobacco instantly enveloped me like a warm, comforting blanket. Alaric was seated behind a massive, elegantly carved wooden desk, deeply engrossed in reviewing complex military documents under the warm glow of a solitary golden lamp. He looked surprisingly devastating and intimately vulnerable without his heavy steel armor or his formal velvet military coats. He wore only a crisp white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the strong throat to reveal a tantalizing glimpse of hardened, battle-scarred muscle. He immediately set down his silver quill the exact fraction of a second that I stepped tentatively into the quiet room. "Come closer to the fire, Amelia," he murmured softly, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating pleasantly through the silent space. I slowly approached his desk, my heart fluttering nervously like a captured, frantic butterfly beating against my tight ribs. He stood up with lethal, predatory grace and deliberately rounded the large desk, closing the vast distance between us in 2 long strides. Instead of standing over me to assert his terrifying dominance, the most feared man in the Empire unexpectedly knelt gracefully at my feet. I gasped sharply in pure, unadulterated shock as he gently lifted the heavy hem of my emerald velvet gown. He carefully inspected the freshly bandaged wounds on my bare feet, the painful injuries caused by the sharp cobblestones during my desperate escape. My personal physician assured me the cuts were quite deep, but they will completely heal without leaving any permanent scars, he said in a hushed tone. His large, calloused thumbs gently stroked the delicate skin of my ankles, sending a jolt of fiery, overwhelming electricity straight up my shivering spine. No man had ever dared to bow before me in my entire life, let alone the Emperor's personal, blood-soaked executioner. "You certainly did not have to check on them yourself, Your Grace," I whispered breathlessly, completely overwhelmed by his shocking tender care. He slowly lifted his handsome head, his stormy grey eyes locking intensely and passionately onto mine in the flickering firelight. "I personally protect exactly what is mine, Amelia, down to the very last meticulous detail," he stated with absolute, unwavering conviction. He stood back up smoothly, his towering, muscular frame instantly dwarfing me in the quiet, deeply intimate room. "In your tragic previous life, Cruel men only ever dictated what you must painfully do to please them, he continued, his tone turning fiercely protective. Under my absolute roof, you will finally have the ultimate freedom to decide exactly what you desire for your own beautiful future. A hot, sudden tear of pure, overwhelming gratitude instantly pricked the corner of my eye before rolling down my flushed cheek. I had spent my entire miserable existence being treated as a worthless bargaining chip by my cruel, financially ruined family. Yet the powerful man globally known as a heartless monster was freely offering me the absolute, breathtaking dignity of choice. I took a brave, decisive step closer to his towering form, eliminating the last few inches of space separating our bodies. What if my only true desire is to stay entirely within these fortress walls with you? I asked, my voice trembling wildly but deeply sincere. A dangerously possessive, breathtaking darkness instantly flooded Alaric's cold grey eyes at my bold, unexpected confession. He reached out incredibly slowly and wrapped one powerful, heavy arm firmly around my narrow waist, pulling me flush against his hard chest. His other warm hand tangled possessively into the thick, loose curls of my hair, gently tilting my head back slightly. His hot breath mingled heavily with mine as he deliberately lowered his lips just a fraction of an inch away from my trembling mouth. Then I will tightly lock the estate gates forever and happily let the rest of the world burn to ash, he whispered fiercely against my lips. Just as his mouth was about to finally claim mine in the romantic firelight, 3 sharp, frantic knocks shattered the heavy silence. Alaric let out a low, dangerously frustrated growl, his sharp jaw clenching tightly as he reluctantly stepped back from my warm body. Enter immediately, he barked angrily, his voice instantly returning to the terrifying, commanding roar of the ruthless executioner. A pale, highly nervous messenger scurried rapidly into the room, bowing so deeply he nearly touched the wooden floorboards. Forgive the terrible late intrusion, Your Grace, but a royal courier just arrived directly from the capital city. The trembling servant held out a heavy parchment scroll sealed tightly with the Emperor's unmistakable, blood-red wax. Alaric snatched the letter from the servant's hands, his terrifying eyes scanning the royal words with cold, calculated precision. The Emperor demands my immediate, mandatory presence at the Grand Autumn Ball tomorrow night, Alaric said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. And he specifically, deliberately requests that I bring my mysterious new female guest to the palace with me. The romantic, intoxicating warmth in the library instantly evaporated entirely, quickly replaced by an icy, suffocating dread. Baron Silas was an incredibly wealthy, high-ranking noble who would undoubtedly be attending that very same prestigious royal event. The ruthless, sadistic monster I had barely escaped was finally going to corner me publicly in front of the entire imperial court. I looked up at Alaric in sheer panic, my entire body violently trembling at the horrifying thought of seeing Silas again. Alaric calmly threw the royal decree directly into the roaring fireplace, watching the Emperor's seal melt into nothingness. Do not fear tomorrow, my sweet Amelia, he promised, his eyes burning with a terrifying, protective madness that thrilled my soul. I am going to let the Baron see you, purely so he can witness exactly what happens to men who covet the Duke's treasure. The royal carriage ride to the opulent imperial palace felt entirely like a terrifying journey toward my own public execution. My heart pounded violently against my ribs beneath the tightly laced bodice of my breathtaking midnight blue silk gown. Alaric had personally commissioned the stunning dress, ensuring it was heavily adorned with hundreds of glittering, flawless diamonds. It made me look significantly less like a desperate, penniless runaway, and entirely like a dark, untouchable queen of the night. He sat directly across from me in the quiet carriage, clad in formal black velvet military regalia adorned with glittering silver medals. His imposing, towering presence easily filled the small space, radiating an intoxicating heat that helped calm my violently trembling hands. Breathe, my beautiful Amelia, he commanded softly, reaching out to gently trace the delicate, high arch of my cheekbone. No one in that sprawling, gilded palace will ever dare to look at you with anything less than absolute reverence tonight. The grand carriage slowly halted before the massive, sweeping marble steps of the ancient, brightly lit imperial estate. A perfectly uniformed royal footman scrambled forward frantically to open the heavy wooden door for the dreaded Duke of Ravenscroft. Alaric stepped out gracefully first, extending his large, leather-gloved hand to guide me safely onto the plush crimson carpet. As I placed my small, trembling hand into his solid, unwavering grip, a powerful surge of undeniable confidence instantly flooded my veins. We walked slowly up the towering marble staircase, the heavy oak doors opening to reveal a dazzling, horribly overcrowded ballroom. Thousands of glittering crystal chandeliers cast a blinding, golden light over the swirling, brightly dressed nobility of the entire empire. The very second the royal herald loudly announced the imposing arrival of the Duke of Ravenscroft, the massive room fell completely silent. The cheerful, lively orchestra abruptly stopped playing, the musicians freezing in pure, unadulterated terror at the sight of the ruthless executioner. Hundreds of curious, deeply fearful eyes instantly locked onto us, burning into my pale skin as we descended the grand velvet staircase. I could clearly hear the shocked, frantic whispers spreading rapidly through the aristocratic crowd like a sudden, vicious wildfire. They were absolutely bewildered that the famously cruel, eternally solitary Duke had actually brought a woman to a public royal event. Alaric completely ignored the staring nobles, placing my trembling hand securely in the comforting crook of his powerful, muscular arm. He guided me effortlessly through the parting sea of terrified aristocrats with the arrogant, undisputed grace of a conquering warrior king. Just as I began to finally relax into the soothing rhythm of his strong stride, a sickeningly familiar voice shattered my fragile peace. Well, if it isn't my treacherous, deeply ungrateful little runaway bride. I froze entirely, my blood turning instantly to jagged, painful ice as Baron Silas stepped forcefully into our immediate path. He was a sickeningly bloated, older man, dressed in ostentatious gold silk that horribly failed to hide his cruel, decaying nature. His watery, malicious eyes raked hungrily over my diamond-studded gown, filled with a disgusting, possessive greed that made my stomach aggressively churn. "I must sincerely thank your grace for finding my lost property," Silas sneered, offering Alaric a mocking, highly disrespectful bow. "My clumsy guards lost her in the storm, but I am absolutely thrilled the Duke has kept my future wife so incredibly safe for me." He actually reached out his sweaty, repulsive hand, fully intending to violently grab my bare arm right in front of the entire stunned court. Before Silas's foul fingers could even brush my delicate skin, Alaric moved with a blinding, terrifying speed that defied all human capability. The Duke's heavy, leather-clad hand forcefully wrapped around the Baron's thick throat, instantly cutting off his foul air supply. Alaric effortlessly lifted the struggling, overweight nobleman entirely off the polished marble floor with just one single, immensely powerful arm. The entire ballroom immediately erupted into horrified gasps, women fainting elegantly into arms and men stepping back in sheer, paralyzing panic. "You dare to reach for what is exclusively mine, Silas?" Alaric whispered, but his lethal, vibrating voice carried safely to the darkest corners of the silent room. "You dare to speak to my cherished companion as if she is a piece of common, rotting meat bought in a filthy back alleyway?" The Baron desperately clawed at the Duke's immovable, iron grip, his arrogant face rapidly turning a terrifying, deeply bruised shade of purple. She signed the legal contract," Silas choked out pathetically, his short legs kicking wildly and uselessly in the empty air. "The only contract you will ever be fulfilling is your inevitable, highly painful appointment with the devil," Alaric growled softly, his stormy eyes completely devoid of any human mercy. I placed my trembling hand gently on Alaric's rigid, furiously tense bicep, silently begging him not to brutally murder the man here. I certainly did not care if Silas died a painful death, but I could never bear the horrifying thought of Alaric being punished by the Emperor for my sake. Feeling my soft, desperate touch, the Duke instantly stopped tightening his lethal grip, his rigidly angry posture relaxing just a tiny fraction. He casually threw the gasping, terrified Baron onto the hard marble floor exactly like a piece of worthless, highly disgusting garbage. Silas immediately collapsed into a pathetic, wheezing heap, coughing violently as he desperately rubbed his severely bruised, bleeding throat. "If you ever dare to look at her again, I will personally ensure you are permanently blinded," Alaric stated calmly, meticulously wiping his glove with a white linen handkerchief. "If you ever speak her beautiful name again, I will ensure your vast, corrupt estate burns completely to the ash-covered ground with you locked inside it." Alaric turned his broad, handsome back on the weeping, publicly humiliated Baron, smoothly offering me his strong arm once again as if nothing had happened. The Emperor himself watched silently from his elevated golden throne, his face pale with shock, completely unwilling to intervene against his own indispensable executioner. Alaric smoothly led me directly to the very center of the grand, glittering ballroom floor, thoroughly ignoring the stunned, absolute silence of the nobility. He gently placed one incredibly warm, firm hand on my waist and expertly took my trembling fingers tightly in his other massive hand. "Music," the Duke commanded sharply, casting a single, terrifying, murderous glare up at the frozen, terrified orchestra balcony. The frantic musicians immediately scrambled to pick up their delicate instruments, hurriedly launching into a sweeping, deeply romantic waltz. Alaric swept me gracefully across the polished marble floor, his movements incredibly fluid and entirely focused solely on my happiness. The entire aristocratic court stood completely frozen around the ornate edges of the room, forced to watch us dance in absolute, terrified awe. "You were incredibly brave back there, my sweet girl," he murmured, his stormy grey eyes softening with a rare, breathtaking affection that melted my soul. "I was absolutely terrified," I admitted honestly, resting my flushed cheek against the hard, incredibly comforting expanse of his broad chest. "You never have to be terrified ever again in your entire life," he vowed, pulling me just a fraction closer into his powerful, fiercely protective embrace. As the beautiful, swelling music washed over us, I knew I was securely anchored to the absolute strongest warrior in the entire kingdom. However, as the romantic waltz slowly ended, a sinister, highly calculating shadow fell across the Emperor's face, hinting at a much darker conspiracy yet to unfold. The magnificent, sweeping melody of the romantic waltz finally faded into the heavy, tense atmosphere of the glittering royal ballroom. I remained safely anchored against Alaric's broad, muscular chest, my trembling fingers gripping his formal velvet jacket for desperate support. Before we could even take a single step toward the towering exit doors, a high-ranking royal guard nervously blocked our designated path. He bowed deeply, his polished silver armor clinking loudly in the deafening, unnatural silence that had completely consumed the aristocratic crowd. "Your Grace, His Imperial Majesty urgently requests your immediate presence in the private solar," the guard announced with a noticeable, fearful stammer. Alaric's heavy, protective arm tightened securely around my waist, pulling me so close that I could feel the suppressed, dangerous rumble of his chest. He did not politely verbally agree to the royal summons, but simply nodded his dark head once with terrifying, arrogant aristocratic indifference. He guided me effortlessly through the winding, lavishly decorated corridors of the ancient palace, leaving the staring, whispering nobility far behind us. The heavy, gilded oak doors of the Emperor's private chambers were swiftly pushed open by two heavily armed palace sentries as we approached. The room was incredibly opulent, filled with priceless woven tapestries, massive roaring fireplaces, and the heavy, suffocating scent of burning frankincense. The aging Emperor sat rigidly behind a massive mahogany desk, his calculating, deeply wrinkled face partially obscured by the flickering golden candlelight. Standing in the dark shadows near the heavily draped window was the bruised, pathetic figure of Baron Silas, clutching his throat with trembling hands. A fresh wave of pure, unadulterated terror violently crashed over me, making my knees incredibly weak beneath my heavy, diamond-encrusted silk gown. Alaric instantly sensed my rising panic, his large, incredibly warm hand sliding down to firmly and reassuringly grasp my own trembling fingers. "You have severely overstepped your bounds tonight, Alaric," the Emperor stated coldly, his sharp voice dripping with highly dangerous, imperial authority. "You publicly humiliated a deeply loyal nobleman and blatantly disrupted a sacred royal event over a common, penniless runaway girl." Alaric did not bother to bow his proud head, standing incredibly tall and completely immovable like a dark, lethal fortress of absolute power. "I merely protected what legally and undeniably belongs to me, Your Majesty," Alaric replied, his low, vibrating voice completely devoid of any respect. The Emperor's eyes narrowed dangerously, his jewel-encrusted fingers drumming impatiently against the polished surface of the heavy wooden desk. "She does not belong to you, Duke of Ravenscroft, because her uncle legally signed her over to Baron Silas in exchange for erasing massive gambling debts." Silas stepped slightly out of the dark shadows, a sickening, triumphant sneer twisting his bruised, deeply unpleasant features into a horrific mask. "The imperial law absolutely supports my legitimate claim to her, Your Grace," the Baron wheezed pathetically, trying to sound incredibly brave behind the Emperor's shield. I squeezed Alaric's massive hand in absolute desperation, silently praying that the powerful Duke would not actually surrender me to the royal decree. Alaric did not even glance at the sniveling Baron, keeping his lethal, stormy grey eyes locked entirely on the aging ruler of the vast empire. "I am not bound by the pathetic, easily manipulated laws written by weak men who desperately hide behind fragile paper treaties," Alaric declared with chilling, absolute finality. The Emperor slammed his heavy fist aggressively against the desk, his face turning a furious, mottled shade of angry crimson at the blatant disrespect. "I am your sovereign ruler, Alaric, and I am officially commanding you to surrender the girl into the custody of the royal guard this very instant." A dozen heavily armored imperial soldiers immediately stepped out from the hidden alcoves of the vast room, drawing their sharp swords with a terrifying, unified metallic hiss. My heart completely stopped beating in my frozen chest, certain that we were about to be violently slaughtered right here in the Emperor's private sanctuary. Instead of surrendering, Alaric let out a dark, genuinely amused, and deeply terrifying chuckle that echoed menacingly off the high, painted ceiling. With a blindingly fast, completely fluid motion, he drew his massive silver broadsword from the heavy leather scabbard resting comfortably at his hip. The sheer, overwhelming size of the magnificent weapon and the legendary, blood-soaked reputation of the man wielding it instantly halted the royal guards in their tracks. "If any man in this room takes one single step toward my woman, I will personally paint these expensive walls with his miserable blood," Alaric vowed softly. The absolute, murderous sincerity in his cold voice sent a violent, collective shiver of sheer terror through every single armed soldier in the room. The Emperor slowly stood up from his gilded chair, his angry expression quickly shifting into one of genuine, deeply unsettled panic. "Are you openly committing high treason against the royal crown for the sake of one single, insignificant woman?" the Emperor demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Alaric smoothly pulled me entirely behind his broad, heavily muscled back, effectively shielding my vulnerable body from every single blade in the hostile room. "She is not insignificant to me, and if keeping her safe requires burning this entire corrupt empire to the ground, then I will happily light the very first match." The heavy silence that followed his shocking, treasonous declaration was absolutely suffocating, pregnant with the terrifying promise of a bloody, devastating civil war. Even the wealthy, arrogant Baron Silas looked completely horrified, finally realizing that his pathetic greed had just sparked a massive, catastrophic conflict. Alaric did not wait for the Emperor to foolishly order an attack that would undoubtedly end in a horrific, one-sided massacre of the royal guards. He began to slowly back away toward the heavy oak doors, his massive sword still raised defensively, his powerful body completely shielding mine. "If you ever send your soldiers to the gates of Ravenscroft, Your Majesty, make absolutely sure they bring their own coffins with them." With that final, chilling promise of ultimate destruction, Alaric kicked the heavy doors completely open and pulled me swiftly out into the grand hallway. We walked rapidly through the opulent palace, leaving behind a terrified, completely paralyzed court that finally understood the true depth of the Duke's dangerous obsession. As we finally stepped back out into the cool, refreshing night air, I looked up at the breathtakingly fierce profile of my dark, ruthless protector. He had just willingly thrown away his entire prestigious position, his wealth, and his imperial standing, entirely to keep me completely safe from harm. I knew then, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that a massive, bloody war was inevitably coming straight to the heavy iron gates of our sanctuary. But as he lifted me gently into the dark carriage and kissed my trembling forehead, I incredibly found myself fearing nothing at all anymore. The frantic, thundering hooves of our massive black warhorses echoed sharply against the cold stone walls as we furiously charged back into the Ravenscroft estate. Heavy iron gates violently slammed shut behind our dark carriage, the unmistakable, deafening crash signaling the absolute lockdown of our impenetrable fortress. Alaric carried me effortlessly up the grand stone steps, his powerful strides completely devoid of the exhausting fatigue that normally follows a terrifying royal confrontation. The entire sprawling manor was already alive with frantic, highly calculated movement, transforming instantly from a quiet sanctuary into a heavily armed military encampment. Dozens of loyal, fiercely devoted soldiers clad in dark steel armor rushed through the vast corridors, meticulously preparing for the inevitable, bloody imperial siege. He did not take me back to my luxurious guest suite, but instead carried me directly into his own massive, heavily fortified private bedchamber. The room was a breathtaking reflection of the dangerous man himself, decorated entirely in dark woods, heavy winter furs, and rows of meticulously sharpened weaponry. He gently set me down onto the edge of his massive, imposing four-poster bed, his stormy grey eyes intensely scanning my pale face for any lingering signs of fear. "You have just sacrificed your entire legendary reputation and your vast imperial standing for a girl you barely know," I whispered, my voice trembling with overwhelming, crushing guilt. "I have caused a massive, bloody war that will undoubtedly bring the entire, devastating wrath of the Emperor crashing down upon your beautiful home." A flash of raw, fierce possessiveness instantly darkened his handsome, aristocratic features as he forcefully tore off his formal velvet jacket and tossed it carelessly onto the wooden floor. He stepped directly between my trembling knees, capturing my tear-stained face firmly within the warm, calloused palms of his incredibly large hands. "Do not ever insult my deliberate, conscious choices by calling yourself a mere girl I barely know," he growled softly, his thumbs gently wiping away my continuously falling tears. "I have spent my entire miserable, blood-soaked life fighting meaningless wars for cowardly men who never truly appreciated my brutal, unending sacrifices. But the very second you threw your freezing, terrified body into my dark carriage, I finally found the absolute only precious thing in this world actually worth dying for." The sheer, breathtaking weight of his profound, desperate confession completely shattered the fragile, lingering walls of my lifelong, crippling insecurity. He wasn't just offering me a temporary, convenient hiding place, he was offering me his entire dark soul, fiercely binding his ultimate fate eternally to mine. I reached up with trembling, hesitant fingers, carefully unbuttoning the crisp white linen shirt that clung tightly to his heavily muscled, magnificently battle-scarred chest. He sucked in a sharp, ragged breath as my soft, delicate palms finally touched the burning hot skin directly over his violently hammering heart. The intoxicating contrast between his legendary, brutal reputation and the incredible, reverent gentleness of his calloused hands completely overwhelmed my racing, feverish senses. With a low, desperate groan, Alaric crushed his mouth fiercely against mine, swallowing my soft gasp in a devastating kiss that tasted of dark promises and eternal devotion. It was not a gentle, polite kiss, but a consuming, fiery claim that thoroughly branded my very soul as his exclusive, permanently untouchable property. His massive hands tangled deeply into my perfectly styled hair, completely ruining the elaborate royal braids as he pulled me flush against his rock-hard, unyielding body. I melted completely into his powerful embrace, kissing the terrifying executioner back with a fierce, desperate hunger that I never even knew I possessed. Every single terrifying memory of my cruel, abusive uncle and the repulsive Baron Silas was instantly incinerated by the consuming, blinding heat of Alaric's undeniable love. I boldly wrapped my arms tightly around his broad, formidable shoulders, anchoring myself entirely to the only man who had ever truly seen my absolute worth. He gently pushed me backward onto the soft, luxurious furs of his massive bed, his towering body hovering protectively over mine like an impenetrable, living shield. He worshipped every single inch of my trembling body as if I were a sacred, priceless goddess descending directly from the heavens above. "You are the undisputed Duchess of Ravenscroft now, my incredibly beautiful Amelia," he murmured passionately against the highly sensitive skin of my arched, flushed neck. "And absolutely no army on this pathetic earth will ever be strong enough to drag you out of my protecting arms." We spent the remaining, precious hours of the dark night entirely lost within the intoxicating, deeply emotional sanctuary of his magnificent, overwhelming embrace. For the very first time in my tragically chaotic life, I felt completely anchored, entirely cherished, and fiercely protected by a man who worshipped the very ground I walked upon. But exactly as the first pale, ominous light of the cold autumn dawn began to slowly bleed through the heavy velvet curtains, a terrifying, deafening sound shattered our peace. The deep, booming toll of the massive warning bell located in the highest stone watchtower echoed aggressively across the sprawling, fortified courtyard. Alaric instantly pulled away from my warm embrace, his stormy eyes instantly hardening back into the cold, ruthless gaze of the kingdom's most lethal, bloodthirsty commander. He swiftly stood up, his muscular back rigid with absolute tension as he reached out to firmly grab his heavy steel armor from the polished wooden stand. The Emperor's massive, heavily armed imperial forces had finally arrived at our reinforced iron gates, actively bringing the promised, catastrophic war directly to our doorstep. I sat up slowly, tightly clutching the thick fur blanket around my bare shoulders, fully prepared to calmly face the terrifying apocalypse as long as he was standing firmly by my side. The deafening, rhythmic booming of the enemy battering rams against our reinforced outer iron gates shook the very foundations of the ancient stone manor. I stood completely frozen by the towering bedroom window, wrapped tightly in a thick velvet robe, watching the horrifying sea of imperial soldiers swarming the valley below. Thousands of golden royal banners snapped violently in the cold morning wind, signaling the immediate arrival of the Emperor's most elite, heavily armored vanguard. At the very front of the invading massive army sat the repulsive Baron Silas, mounted proudly on a white stallion and sneering with sickening, premature triumph. He foolishly believed that the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the imperial military would easily crush the isolated, defiant Duke of Ravenscroft into bloody submission. But Silas was merely a cowardly, pathetic politician who had never personally witnessed the true, devastating horror of the Emperor's legendary executioner fully unleashed upon a battlefield. Alaric strapped his heavy, deeply scarred black steel chest plate over his broad shoulders, his movements terrifyingly calm and meticulously precise. He did not look like a man desperately preparing for a hopeless final stand, but rather like a dark, vengeful god calmly preparing to harvest thousands of unworthy souls. He walked smoothly over to where I stood trembling by the cold glass, his massive, armored hand gently cupping my pale cheek with an achingly tender, profound reverence. "Do not avert your beautiful eyes from the window today, my sweet Amelia," he commanded softly, his stormy grey eyes burning with an intense, lethal promise. "I want you to safely witness exactly the terrifying extent of the absolute destruction I am willing to rain down upon anyone who dares to threaten our eternal peace." He pressed one final, deeply bruising kiss to my trembling lips before turning his broad back and striding out of the room like a magnificent, unstoppable force of nature. I pressed my shaking hands desperately against the cold window pane, my heart hammering violently in my throat as I watched him emerge into the vast, heavily fortified courtyard. Hundreds of fiercely loyal Ravenscroft soldiers immediately roared their absolute, unwavering support, banging their heavy swords aggressively against their dark steel shields. Suddenly, the massive outer iron gates finally buckled with an earth-shattering screech, crashing heavily to the ground and allowing the arrogant imperial army to flood into the estate. The confident royal commander immediately ordered his frontline troops to charge forward, fully expecting to overwhelm the outnumbered defenders in a matter of mere bloody minutes. However, Alaric did not foolishly order his defensive archers to fire, nor did he command his heavy shield wall to advance toward the incoming, charging enemy forces. Instead, the towering Duke of Ravenscroft stepped out entirely alone, walking calmly directly into the chaotic, deadly path of the charging royal vanguard. He drew his massive, legendary silver broadsword from its scabbard, the lethal, gleaming blade catching the cold morning sunlight in a terrifying display of incoming doom. The very first wave of heavily armored imperial soldiers reached him, their sharp spears thrusting aggressively toward his unprotected chest in a unified, deadly strike. With a blindingly fast, devastating sweep of his heavy blade, Alaric effortlessly cleaved through their wooden shields and thick steel armor as if they were made of fragile parchment. He moved through the chaotic, bloody battlefield with a terrifying, unnatural grace, becoming a lethal, unstoppable blur of dark steel and unyielding, brutal muscle. Every single powerful strike he delivered was perfectly calculated, instantly terminating any foolish man who dared to step within the deadly radius of his swinging weapon. The imperial soldiers quickly realized with dawning, absolute horror that they were not fighting a mere mortal man, but actively battling a legendary, invincible demon of war. Panic rapidly spread through the highly trained royal ranks like a terrifyingly contagious disease as Alaric single-handedly decimated their elite frontline with horrifying efficiency. Baron Silas watched the terrifying slaughter from the supposed absolute safety of the rear lines, his sickly pale face twisting into a horrific mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He desperately yanked hard on the leather reins of his white stallion, frantically attempting to turn around and flee the horrific massacre he had foolishly initiated. But Alaric's piercing, stormy grey eyes locked onto the cowardly nobleman directly across the blood-soaked courtyard, his intense gaze filled with a terrifying, absolute promise of death. The Duke violently shoved a terrified royal guardsman aside, cutting a direct, bloody path straight through the chaotic heart of the violently crumbling imperial army. The frantic royal commander desperately screamed for his remaining soldiers to protect the Baron, but absolutely no man was brave enough to stand in the path of the executioner's wrath. Alaric closed the vast distance with terrifying, predatory speed, his heavy steel boots effortlessly crushing the fallen golden banners of the supposedly invincible empire beneath his heels. With one final, immensely powerful leap, Alaric launched himself directly toward the fleeing Baron, his massive broadsword raised high above his dark, helmetless head. He brought the heavy metal pommel of his sword down fiercely against the skull of Silas's horse, forcing the terrified animal to rear up violently and throw its shrieking rider. Silas crashed heavily onto the hard, muddy ground, sobbing pathetically as the towering, blood-splattered Duke stepped calmly over his trembling, pathetic body. Alaric slowly raised his gleaming silver blade, his stormy eyes briefly looking up toward my high bedroom window, silently dedicating this ultimate, bloody victory entirely to me. I watched in breathless, terrifying awe as the most dangerous man in the kingdom completely humiliated the only monster who had ever made me feel powerless. Alaric did not offer the weeping Baron a swift, honorable death, but instead violently pinned the screaming coward to the muddy earth with the heavy heel of his armored boot. "You were explicitly warned never to approach my iron gates again," Alaric roared, his booming voice completely silencing the chaotic, terrified battlefield surrounding them. The remaining, highly demoralized imperial soldiers immediately dropped their heavy weapons in pure terror, falling to their trembling knees to completely surrender to the undisputed victor. The great, supposedly unstoppable royal siege had been completely broken in mere minutes by the breathtaking, terrifying devotion of a single, fiercely protective lover. The heavy, suffocating silence of the defeated imperial army hung over the blood-stained courtyard like a thick, heavy shroud of total, unconditional surrender. Alaric did not strike the fatal, merciful blow against the pathetic, sobbing man groveling violently beneath his heavy steel boot. Instead, he reached down with one massive, armored hand and violently ripped the golden noble crest directly from Baron Silas's expensive, mud-stained silk coat. You are hereby stripped of all your earthly lands, your stolen wealth, and your aristocratic titles, Alaric declared, his booming voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. You will spend the rest of your miserable, worthless existence breaking rocks in the frozen, dark depths of the northern imperial mines. The horrified Baron shrieked in absolute terror, begging desperately for a swift death, but Alaric's loyal guards immediately dragged the weeping coward away in heavy iron chains. Before the morning sun had even fully crested the majestic horizon, a frantic, trembling royal envoy arrived bearing an official, heavily sealed decree directly from the terrified emperor. The cowardly ruler had officially pardoned the Duke of Ravenscroft for his actions, desperately terrified of losing his entire grand empire to Alaric's unstoppable, bloody wrath. More importantly, the royal decree formally annulled my uncle's wicked contract, legally recognizing me forever as the undisputed, permanent Duchess of Ravenscroft. The brutal, terrifying war that I had desperately feared would destroy everything had ended in a matter of mere minutes with an absolute, undeniable victory for the man who claimed me. When Alaric finally returned to our massive, sunlit bedchamber, he was completely covered in dark mud and the bloody remnants of the morning's brief, horrific slaughter. He stopped hesitantly near the heavy oak doors, his broad shoulders suddenly tense, perhaps fearing that the violent monster he had just unleashed upon the world would finally terrify me away. But I did not see a terrifying, ruthless executioner standing cautiously before me in that quiet, peaceful room. I only saw the fiercely devoted, magnificent warrior who had willingly faced an entire armed empire just to ensure I could finally sleep without an ounce of fear. I ran quickly across the soft, luxurious rugs, completely ignoring the sharp metallic edges of his dark armor, and threw my arms tightly around his thick, muscular neck. He let out a shaky, overwhelming breath of pure relief, dropping his heavy silver sword loudly to the floor and crushing me instantly against his hard, intensely protective chest. His large, calloused hands tangled deeply into my loose hair as he buried his handsome face into the warm, incredibly soft curve of my neck. "It is completely over, my beautiful queen," he murmured fiercely, his deep voice vibrating with an exhausting, profound emotion that brought hot, happy tears to my eyes. "No one will ever hunt you, hurt you, or dare to try and take you away from me ever again." I closed my eyes and breathed in the dark, intoxicating scent of rich leather, cold steel, and the undeniable, absolute safety of his powerful, eternal embrace. I thought back to that stormy, terrifying night when I had desperately thrown myself blindly into the pitch-black, deeply feared carriage of a legendary demon. I had run blindly into the dangerous dark to desperately escape a horrifying, forced marriage, fully expecting to find only a tragic, highly painful death hidden in the shadows. Instead, I had miraculously discovered an incredibly fierce, eternally loyal protector who was willing to happily burn the entire world to ash just to keep me warm. I tilted my head up, capturing his lips in a slow, deeply passionate kiss that forever sealed my ultimate, beautiful destiny. I was finally home, safely locked forever in the fiercely protective arms of my beautiful, terrifying Duke.